Hello and welcome everyone. Welcome to the Alaska World Affairs Council program. It's not just over there, consequences of war and instability on the Korean Peninsula. This program is in partnership with the Stimson Center, Stimson's 38 Degree North program, American College of National Security Leaders, Korea Defense Veterans Association, and World Trade Center Anchorage. It's about 55 degrees and raining here in Alaska, and we hope it's fresh air wherever you are located today. This is the 63rd year the Alaska World Affairs Council has been bringing the world to Alaska, and we're super excited about this opportunity to partner with the organizations like the Stimson Center from afar for virtual events like this one. The Alaska World Affairs Council is a nonpartisan, non-political organization and believes that providing the community a wide spectrum of viewpoints for a sound democratic citizenship and peace. Alaska World Affairs Council is part of 95 councils around the United States, and we welcome everyone who is listening to join in the conversation and ask some questions during our Q&A period at the end. Before we start, please say hello to our speakers and each other. You can introduce yourself using the chat function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Tell us your name, tell us where in the world you are located, and maybe a shout out to what the weather is looking like in your part of the world. I see some familiar faces and names of people joining us today and some new people. If you are returning for an Alaska World Affairs Council program, it's really great to see you. If you are new to an Alaska World Affairs Council program, welcome. I hope you come back for some of our other great programs lined up this year. We have a small fraction of them located on our website. We're going to be posting more soon, but you'll see on our website that on Friday, September 11th, we're going to be featuring Alaska's Nick Hansen, our very own ninja warrior, who will talk about how Alaska's ninja warrior is changing the world. We also have another up-and-coming Alaskan, Dr. Zach Brown, on September 25th, and he's going to be talking about trekking the climate crisis from knowledge to action. And backed by popular demand, we have Dr. Young Zhao on the 2nd of October, who will be talking about the future of education in a post-pandemic world. And now I would like to turn over the program to Dr. Clint Work, who is a fellow with the Stimson Center and will be moderating today's program. Dr. Work.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Lisa. And thank you to you, Siobhan, and of course the entire Alaska World Affairs Council for partnering with us in this timely program, and also for your wonderful outreach efforts. I was looking at the RSVP list before the event, and there were quite a few Alaskans from different professions and organizations. So we really have maintained a sort of local feel to an otherwise virtual event. And as I was telling you before the event, my colleagues and I at Stimson and Stimson's 38 North had originally planned to visit Alaska in person as part of our state and district outreach. And we were all very excited because none of us had been, but of course, COVID has disrupted the best laid plans for all of us. So zooming in like this is the next best thing, and hopefully a step towards ultimately coming to visit sometime down the road. As the title of our program indicates, a key takeaway message is that the US connection and commitment to South Korea and to the Korean Peninsula as a whole is really not just over there. In fact, it's as important as it's ever been. In some states and congressional districts, this can actually be a tough sell. However, Alaska's history, its geography, and its strategic location make this connection much easier to draw. In fact, Alaska is arguably one of the most Asian Pacific states in the Union. And indeed, long before it became a state, it was directly intertwined with American foreign policy, diplomacy, and international trade in the region. And its strategic importance became all the more important during World War II, and even more so during the Korean War, and of course, with the onset of the Cold War, even before it became a state in January of 1959. And its importance has only grown since then. The state has a long military tradition and the highest per capita rate of military veterans in the country. It also has a significant Air Force, an Army presence, and is home to interceptors for the National Missile Defense System, all of which play a crucial role in any Korean contingency and also provide important training and readiness opportunities for US and allied forces during peacetime. But Alaska has many important non-military links and connections to the Korean Peninsula as well. The state exports roughly 800 million in goods and services to South Korea, making up about 22% of its exports to the region and 13% of its exports globally, which creates about 3,500 jobs in the state. In 2018, Korean international students made up about 12% of the international students in the state, and Korean tourists spent about 22 million on their visits to the state. And maybe most importantly, nearly 7,000 Korean Americans live in Alaska, making up over 11% of the state's Asian population. So in sum, there are numerous historical, military, and economic and people-to-people connections between Alaska and Korea. So it's in the spirit of that connection that we bring you our panel, and I'm very pleased to introduce our speakers. The first is Major General Rick Martin, who joins us from the American College of National Security Leaders. Rick served 36 years in the Air Force as a commander, a pilot, and a staff officer, and among many other important positions, he served at the Pentagon, managing political military policy on the Korean Peninsula, and as a delegate with the State Department during negotiations with North Korea. Alongside General Martin is Colonel Steve Lee. Steve is a Korea expert with over 20 years of experience working in Korea, the Pentagon, and the intelligence community, and is currently the Senior Vice President of the Korea Defense Veterans Association based in Northern Virginia. Steve is interviewed on NBC's The Today Show and Fox News, and has moderated and participated on many panels like our own today. Lastly, my colleague Jenny Town is a fellow at Stimson and the Deputy Director of 38 North, which is a website devoted to providing policy and technical analysis on North Korea. And in addition to her research and many media appearances, Jenny has experience in track 2 diplomacy with North Korean officials. In terms of today's format, I'm going to have an interview-style conversation with our 3 speakers, and then at about the midway point, we'll transition to an audience Q&A. The Q&A function is already open, so as your questions arise during our conversation, please feel free to put them there, but do please be concise, 1 to 2 sentences tops, and identify a particular speaker if you have somebody in mind. So without further ado, I want to direct the first question I have to General Martin. So generally speaking, the underlying mission of US forces in South Korea is often characterized as deterring North Korea and assisting in the defense of South Korea if deterrence fails. However, this does really sound like the mission is over there. Why then should Americans, especially in Alaska, care what happens on the Korean Peninsula?
Thank you, Clint. Lisa, thank you. I'll jump right into it here. You talked about the U.S. mission and the purpose of the alliance, now 70 years strong, deterring DPRK aggression, which is really discouraging or restraining action by North Korea, likely in the form of conventional nuclear missile attack on South Korea or an intercontinental nuclear missile aimed at the U.S. or other countries, and as well as deterring nuclear testing, further nuclear testing, or the pursuit of a nuclear weapon. Should that deterrence fail, then maintaining a very capable defense is key. The capability to defend the ROC and U.S. homelands and our interests and allied interests in the region. These 2 concepts of deterrence and defense are linked, both in capability to deter and defend, and the perception by the North Koreans that the U.S. will respond accordingly, along with the ROC. So clear and consistent messaging is key in this regard. So I want to thank the World Affairs Council for reinforcing this important topic and this message, the importance of the alliance, and the importance of Alaska, not only to the U.S., but to all things Korea. So Alaska, why is Alaska key? Why is what happens over there in Korea linked to Alaska and the U.S.? Now, I'm going to answer that in 2 ways, one operational and the second strategically. Operationally, the military operations, and then in a broader, more geopolitical, national security strategic value. I like to quote General Billy Mitchell. He was the father of the United States Air Force. He testified before Congress in 1935, even before Alaska was a state in 1959. He said that whoever controls Alaska controls the world. And I think, he said, it is the most strategic place in the world. Pretty prescient of him back in 1935. So operationally, Alaska forces stationed there, as were indicated, Army, largely Army Air Force, they add both capability and capacity being depth, to the military response capability for the Pacific and specifically for Korea in that region. Most of the capabilities in Alaska are Army and Air Force. However, some are Navy and Marine, although they're largely in reserve units. And these capabilities in the Army and Air Force include missile defense and warning, infantry augmentation, air attack, air intelligence, surveillance, surface-to-air missile suppression, command and control, rescue forces, quite a bit. I could go on. There's also, once the F-35s come down to Fairbanks area, there'll be more advanced fighters in Alaska than anywhere in the world. Pretty remarkable. And on top of the F-22s that Lisa can tell you about there in Anchorage. Alaska is part of an intricate array of early warning and missile defense radars across Alaska and the polar region, which is also key not only to our Air Force and Army, but it's key to every service, including the new US Space Force. Alaska is also host to numerous key military exercises, and each of them promote training, readiness, and interoperability of our allies in the Pacific and around the world. Those exercises are Red Flag Alaska, Exercise Northern Edge, and Arctic Edge. And they involve active guard reserve from all the services and our allies, including the Koreans and Japanese. They promote not only interoperability, but they enhance defense warning in C2. Now, this is really key because we've reduced exercises on the peninsula. And so these exercises in Alaska are even more critical. Of course, there's also the Army's Northern Warfare Training Center at Fort Wainwright near Fairbanks that specializes in cold weather ops. All of these units support the unity of command, the unity of effort in the Pacific, which is Indo-Pacific Command, the Pacific Air Forces, the Naval Pacific Air Forces, the Marine, and Navy, but also in Korea and Japan too. On a strategic level, just a couple more points here. Alaska is leading in the Arctic scientific research, and that supports commerce through the polar region and the Arctic environmental concerns. And it is these freedom of navigation routes in the Arctic region, in some cases they're contested areas, especially with the Russians, that become increasingly important as an area of interest, especially when we think of logistics support to a contingency in Korea. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I see the two-finger intervention from Colonel Lee, so I'm going to turn to him now.
Just a couple more points. Reason why Americans care about South Korea. There's a mutual defense treaty that was signed in 1953. We have a long 7-decade strategic partnership with South Korea, strong economic ties, lots of cultural ties, 2 million Korean Americans. South Korea has deployed militaries in Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq, and Somali pirate operations off the coast of in the Persian Gulf, all to support the United States. Obviously, Alaska has a huge role in the security of the United States, especially in the Indo-Pacific region, as General Martin mentioned. Then something that I thought was pretty cool, your governor, Mike Dunleavy, declared June 25th, 2020 as a Korea-Alaska Friendship Day. And he mentioned some of the really cool things, Alaska appreciates the Korean community's many contributions to the economic and cultural diversity of the last frontier. Specifically mentioned Korean Air, Asiana Air, for all of their facilitation of international trade between Korea and Alaska. Talked about the long-standing mutual beneficial trading partnership. And what I really did appreciate the governor doing is also saying that Alaska remembers and honors the Korean War veterans that are still with us. So I think for all of those reasons and many more, so many things that Americans should care about, and certainly Koreans also care about America as well. Over to you, Clint.
Well, don't go too far, Colonel Lee, because I'm directing this one right back at you.
Okay.
While the phrase "all options are on the table" is often used during times of high tension, for example, in 2017, there's always considerable pushback to the idea of the use of force against North Korea, despite all of its rogue behavior. Why do you think this is? And are military options or responses to North Korea's WMD or weapons of mass destruction ambitions really a viable solution?
Yeah, so, there is pushback on possible option of using force against North Korea because there is concern that using force could escalate. This is because North and South Korea have been divided along the demilitarized zone, or DMZ, which separates the two forces. And along that DMZ, and just beyond on both sides, much of the military combat power of both sides are postured in the event that something happens. Over the past 7 decades, there have been dozens of provocations and exchanges of fire, almost all started by North Korea. Since the signing of the Armistice Agreement in 1953, the two Koreas have taken two dramatically different paths. And everyone has seen the satellite imagery, black North Korea, lit up South Korea. And, that's because North Korea has become a failed state. They have very few friends and allies around the world, and the country is controlled by a regime whose number one priority is their own survival, care very little about their people. In very sharp contrast is the democratic South Korea, which has developed into one of the world leaders in technology, industry, social influence, and economic power. Raise your hands if you have Samsung, Hyundai, LG, Kia product in your house. Probably most, right? Most of South Korea's success obviously are due to their people and their hardworking and their wonderful leaders over the past decade. But most Koreans will say that their strong and long-standing relationship with the United States has supported and helped them get there. There's no question about that. And they are very thankful, especially for the American troops who are there all the time. Then you have Seoul, South Korea's capital. It's one of the most advanced modern cities in the world with 25 million people. Yes, 25 million people in this metropolitan area. Unfortunately, it's only about 25 miles from that DMZ that I just described, which is within long-range artillery from North Korea. So South Korea's strategic vulnerability is a legitimate concern when talking about the use of force. But for North Korea, they also have to be very careful, because if they allow a confrontation to escalate or get to a point of no return and there is war, the regime would be destroyed. There's no question about that. So the risk is great for South Korea's modern society, but it will certainly rebuild if there is a war. But the risk to North Korea, if there is a use of force, is far greater, because it would be the end of its regime. So looking at all options is the smart and prudent thing to do, so that we can apply the right option, whether it's diplomatic, informational, military, economic, at the right time to get the results that we want. And having all options on the table is an essential element in engaging with North Korea. We have been and will continue to be on a long road of engagement, threats, and confrontations with North Korea. It has been this way for 7 decades, unfortunately. And while we continue to navigate through the many turns, obstacles, U-turns, and changes in our dealings with North Korea, we need to have all options open so we can make the best decision in any situation. So we should not handcuff ourselves by limiting our options, because that gives North Korea an advantage without North Korea having to do anything. And we certainly should not give away anything to North Korea, especially since North Korea can't be trusted. They need to know that until they have demonstrated over time that they can be trusted to keep their word, they need to understand that the full weight of American and South Korean national powers are available to keep them in check. So Clint, over to you. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Steve. Make a very good point. And, of course, North Korea's ICBM and missile capabilities now threaten the U.S. in a way they never had historically. Yeah. But that strategic threat is something that, South Korean Seoulites have been living with for as long as the country's existed. I want to turn to my colleague, Jenny Town. She's got the 2 fingers, so I'm gonna give her a chance to respond to that last question before I ask the next. Jenny?
Yeah, I just wanted to add quickly, though, it's one thing to say that all options are on the table and to plan for a variety of contingencies. I think the reality is, though, that in order to enact some of those plans, especially the ones that use force against North Korea, there has to be a level of cooperation that right now in the region just isn't there. China, the way the Chinese look at the situation is they don't want North Korea to have nuclear weapons, but it's not worth going to war for. And you see a lot of that sentiment in South Korea as well, although it does vary from generation and political bent. So I think it would be very difficult to convince the region and other regional actors that what North Korea is doing rises to the level of risking war, especially since the scars of the Korean War are still relatively fresh. And so those memories are still there, those first generations are still there and affected, and there is a real reluctance in the region to use force, which also the North Koreans know. And I think, that allows the North Koreans, as Steve said, to be more adventurous and to push that envelope more. And so, we have a very complex situation here where, even the more we talk about the idea that all options are on the table, it also reinforces North Korea's own justifications for their nuclear weapons. So it becomes a self-reinforcing cycle, as they're looking at the situation thinking, hey, we're the only country here that doesn't have nuclear weapons or didn't have nuclear weapons and doesn't have any sworn allies. It has some friends that may or may not come to its assistance, but we're sitting in the middle of a region where everyone else has nuclear weapons. The US, Russia, China as P5 countries, and Japan and South Korea by default through extended deterrence. And so, the more we put it on the table and the more especially that we message it, I think it actually has a counter, what's the word? The counter effect than what we actually want it to have.
Thank you for that intervention, Jenny. The self-fulfilling cycle of this security architecture. I'm going to stay with you and sort of ask you to build a little bit on a point that both you and Steve were alluding to, which is sort of the North Korean perspective. Currently in US-DPRK relations, we're somewhere between where we were with the fire and fury of 2017 and then the more hopeful and even historic diplomacy of 2018 and early 2019. Where do you see events trending in the coming months? And as best we can tell, what are North Korea's intentions? We've touched on some of the constraints that, of course, the US and allies face, and that hinders US and allied policy. What complicates and hinders Kim Jong-un's calculations?
It's a good question. I think it's something that we're always trying to figure out. Obviously, right now, North Korea is dealing with a lot of internal issues, as most countries around the world are. COVID-19 hit us all a little bit by surprise this year, and especially, I don't think anyone foresaw the global effect and the global impact that it would have. Kim Jong-un at the end of last year laid out some interesting remarks at the December party plenum meeting, where he did already signal that more difficult times were ahead. So this was even before COVID-19. And he did sort of raise the expectation that North Koreans may have to tighten their belts again. And this was a big thing for him to curb that expectation, where in the past he had always talked about, we're not going back there, the economy is going to be great, and no one should have to tighten their belts again. So I think, he had already internalized the idea that that better diplomacy was not going to lead to instant results on the economy. It wasn't leading to instant sanctions relief. It wasn't leading to instant business happening that didn't happen before. And I think that was some of what was driving their diplomacy over the last couple of years, of what could they get quickly in order to jumpstart the economy to make good on some of these other promises on the domestic agenda. And obviously COVID-19 hit. And so since January, late January, North Korea's borders have been closed to no trade, no business, no tourism, which was the majority of the North Korean economy. And so, they are dealing with a lot of difficult times. And you see also, this probably has delayed a lot of their security and diplomacy initiatives as well. At the end of December, North Korea Kim Jong-un said he was going to demonstrate or reveal a new strategic weapon, which we have not seen yet, which most likely was delayed because of COVID-19. that we may still see in the coming months. But I do think it's going to be relatively quiet in the coming months because North Korea is still dealing with COVID-19. It is, the messaging coming out from Kim Jong-un is really focused on domestic issues, public welfare, but also of, preparing a 5-year economic plan that now they plan to release in January, and preparing for the 75th anniversary of the Workers' Party. And so, these are all initiatives that are very, very inwardly focused, that, unless the US were to make some dramatic gesture to show that a different proposition was on the table, I don't think North Korea has any confidence that there's any reason to come back to the table with the administration right now before an election, that they would be proposed anything different than what they've seen before.
Thank you, Jenny, for the comprehensive answer. Impossible not to touch on a multitude of different factors, right? Because it's so complex and obviously so many question marks, not just for North Korea. Just a quick point of order. I see some people may be asking questions in the chat box. If you could take those questions and put them in the Q&A box instead, it could logistically make it easier for us to queue them up. And I'm going to turn to audience Q&A in a moment, but I do want to direct one additional question to General Martin first, and then maybe Steve, you could follow up as well. In recent weeks, there's been a lot of talk of COVID cases among USFK personnel, United States Forces Korea personnel in Korea. And in fact, the springtime exercises were canceled due to COVID, and the current summertime exercises were scaled down as a result of the virus. Do you think COVID-19 has had much of an impact on US readiness and its ability to, quote unquote, fight tonight, as they say? General Martin.
Yeah, Clint, I mean, everyone's asking that question. The short answer is no. Has it had an impact on our quality of life? Yes. Has it had some impact on our ability to train to some degree, but we remain ready to fight tonight. And the reason I say that is, a life of service, military preparedness, being ready, thinking through contingencies, branches and sequels, military planning, military discipline, all lend itself to being ready to fight tonight, whatever the circumstance is. I've got many friends still, obviously, in the military. Our daughter's in the service. I'm watching it firsthand, how we are dealing with this COVID crisis. Not only in Korea, where it's a fight tonight, but everywhere. It's prepared, mission focused to be able to do the job that they're given to do. Even though we see now that COVID has maybe tripled in the ROC. And so we've got to help them through that.
So I think no, COVID-19 has not hindered the South Korean and US ability to be ready to defend South Korea against a possible North Korean attack or North Korean provocation. In some ways, COVID-19 has helped readiness by making all commanders and service members more aware of the need to be ready by taking care of themselves, looking out for their buddies, and having a stronger connection to South Korea. Our 4-star commander in Korea, General Robert Abrams, his #1 priority every day is to protect the force. And so protecting the force amid the pandemic is a way of life now for our 28,500 service members in Korea. This extends to everything they do. Of course, they still train at the individual, small unit and crew levels, and larger formations. They just adapt to COVID-19 precautionary measures. By adjusting and refining something, that's something that our military does very well, as General Martin mentioned. It doesn't matter where we serve. You may have heard about the ongoing major training exercise in Korea. It ends on the 28th of August. It is a command post exercise, or CPX, and not a field training exercise, or FTX. I was asked many times before, hey, why don't you guys call it a CPE? The E is for exercise. And I think it's because X sounds more hip and exciting. That's X with, that's the exciting with an X. But anyways, these CPXs, they integrate computer-generated scenarios with real-time decisions and actions that our leaders in the ROK and US Combined Forces Command, or CSC, make. And so CPXs are very important way for the alliance to build the CFC warfighting team, grow our alliance stronger, and maintain a vital deterrence against North Korea. So our forces in Korea, they're doing what needs to be done to ensure that they remain ready. No questions about it. Back to you, Clint.
Thank you, Steve. Actually, I was curious why it was CPX and not CPE. So you answered that question for me. I see we have two questions to be exact, and they ask about the same issue, and I'm not surprised to see this because many people are asking this. Friends of mine ask me this all the time. In light of Kim Jong-un's health issues and now rumors that that he may be in a coma, and that his sister, excuse me, could be sort of taking a more prominent role in the party and in the government, what would the implications be of Kim Jong-un passing and Kim Yo-jong taking over? And more specifically, as one of the questions asks, would this increase the chances of peaceful reunification? Would it make it more realistic or not? So generally speaking, what do our panelists see as the implications for such a scenario? And I'll ask Jenny maybe if she could answer first.
Well, first, I wouldn't give too much credence to the rumors that are out there. I mean, this is all based on a single source in China, which is exactly the same source that that seems to have started the rumor back in April. So it's basically the same rumor being recycled and then being widely publicized, especially by tabloids around the world. The question of what is Kim Yo-jong's role, I think is an evolving story. A lot of people talk about, maybe she's being groomed to be the successor. I think actually, the opposite might be true. Looking more so at how they're using her and how she's rising. I think, she's obviously a confidant to Kim Jong-un. And I think they're trying to build her credentials to hold more power, but to support him. As a woman, people talk about this a lot of North Korea being a very patriarchal society. It's hard to imagine, what kind of power she would have and how she would be able to legitimize herself if she were to be labeled the successor. That would be a long-term process if they were going to do it. I think there may be some efforts now to increase her credentials as a contingency plan, like if something does happen to Kim Jong-un suddenly. But I think more so because she's a woman, she's able to stand next to him and support him without threatening his power as a brother would, per se. So, if something suddenly did happen to Kim Jong-un, would she be able to create the kind of legitimization she would need in order to keep the country from a big power vacuum forming? It's anyone's guess at this point. Certainly, she is treated like a member of the Kim family and is shown the deference of a Kim family member, but how that would translate into compliance, in that event, it's really hard to tell. And, we've done a number of reports on 38 North that talk about contingency planning and the number of things that could go wrong if there is instability in North Korea. So let's hope on some level that Kim Jong-un is okay. As odd as that is to say.
Yeah, as odd as that is to say. Steve, do I see you'd like to add something?
Yeah, just real quick. Actually, things like this where you're talking about a whole bunch of a range of scenarios. That's one of the purposes of the exercises that Combined Forces Command is going through right now. Where they talk through, this is what we do in the event something like this happens. And so that's very important. So the reason I bring that up is, just have no doubt that if there is a very sudden change in the leadership of the North Korean regime, our military certainly is going to be ready and postured to do whatever is needed. That's not propaganda, that's just facts, okay? So just be aware of that. I think one of the things that we as a alliance, a government need to do right now is just make sure that if there is a sudden change in the regime, that we're prepared for it. The last time this happened in December 2011, I was on the Joint Staff, working as a North Korea desk officer, advising the chairman and vice chairman. And I think we were caught a little bit by surprise, quite honestly, I'll just say that up front. And so one of the key lessons learned was just making sure that we have an interagency process. And once we get our ideas in line and within the interagency process, which isn't always easy, then we need to make sure that we engage with the South Koreans so that we do this together and that there isn't any seams. So I think those are the kind of things that need to happen right now.
General Martin.
I'll add, I agree that this is rumor at this point. I think there's indications that Kim Yo-jong might be in number 2 of the policy with regard to South Korea and the United States in leading up the OGD department. But I read a study by the American Enterprise Institute recently. And this individual in the American Enterprise, a scholar there, did a study of all the dictatorships since World War II. And in the entire world, none lasted more than 3 generations. So the likelihood that a dictatorship would pass on to a 4th member of the Kim family here, with the presumption is unlikely. But what it does highlight that Jenny and Steve alluded to and specifically stated is the importance of relationships with South Korea. I'm going to say with China as well, to discuss this, planning with instability in North Korea, watching our intelligence and warning indicators for that country. We realize that the North Korean government is very kind of a one-trick pony, very brittle, very capable. And so if they're handling the flooding going on in August and COVID, and now a secession of leadership, we've got to really be careful and watch and help where we can in that region.
Thank you. I see we've got another question in the Q&A. I just want to quickly, Jenny mentioned 38 North, the website. I've just put the link to the website, a little shameless self-promotion there for our attendees who aren't familiar. Please go check out the website. There's constant new weekly, really daily updates of analysis and commentary on these issues. The next question is about essentially the U.S. force presence, particularly some of the bases and how they've been realigned over time. And they ask, has the departure from Yongsan and the consolidation at Camp Humphreys had any impact on the relationship between the USFK and the ROK government? I might just quickly add for attendees who aren't familiar with this, there have been historically dozens and dozens of US bases in Korea. Over time, they've been consolidated and gradually realigned further south. Yongsan is a base that's in central Seoul, just north of the Han River. And gradually, really since the end of the Cold War, it's been realigned further south to now Camp Humphreys and Osan Air Base, which is actually the largest US military installation outside of the United States. I would direct that question to our speakers. Has this had any impact on the relationship between USFK and the ROK government? Steve?
Yes, in the sense that, with the USFK headquarters, and specifically with General Abrams down in Camp Humphreys, about 35 miles away, direct communication face-to-face takes a little bit more planning and a little more time. But, we have the technology. Of course, the U.S. military and the South Korean military have a version of Zoom that's far, far more capable at all security levels. And they've got them on their desk. And I know, having served with both General Thurman and General Scaparrotti as a special advisor, that they can literally just talk to each other on a secure level at any time. So the distance itself doesn't affect it that much. I tell you, the only thing that does impact it, especially when there's adverse weather and can't fly, is again, there's a delay. As opposed to a 5-minute ride to do a face-to-face meeting, might have to do a couple-hour convoy up, depending on traffic. It's only about a 15-20-minute helicopter ride, no problem, as long as weather allows. But relationships in South Korea are very, very, very important. And so that's the only thing that's really impacting the USFK's relationship with the South Korean government overall.
General Martin.
And I'll add to Steve's comments. I think from a host nation perspective as well, and Steve mentioned this, the importance of being good guests and being mindful of the congestion in Seoul and that very prime real estate that now Iraq occupies. I think that's a key part of this. And while there's some command and control and some communication challenges to Camp Humphreys, there's also some unity of effort and unity of command there that is helpful. But ultimately, we want to maintain good guest status and be mindful, sensitive to ROC preferences.
Okay, so we've got another question in the Q&A, and this is one that actually I field constantly from friends and family of mine they always pose this question. The questioner asks, during the Cold War, our adversaries were for the most part rational. It's not clear that the North Korean rulers are rational with either their own citizens or with other nations, perhaps with the exception of China and Russia. What are the speaker's views? If they're not rational, can the Western world allow them to build global weapons? Jenny, would you like to take a stab?
Well, I think the key question here is, can we allow them to do so? Well, they've already done so. They've already tested, nuclear weapons. They've done 7 underground tests. They've done, several ballistic missile tests. They've tested, flight tested ICBMs. They've already made that decision, and we have not been able to stop them. I think there was a lot of talk, especially, in every administration, of narrowing Pyongyang's choices. How do we narrow Pyongyang's choices? How do we get them on the track that we want them to be on? And certainly, again, by threatening their destruction, doesn't convince them that they don't need nuclear weapons. So I think there's a whole level of hubris here that we can prevent them from doing this, especially if we're not willing to use force to stop them, which again, the region is very reluctant to do. But I think there's also a level here of sequencing. What does it take to gain the trust of North Korea? If you do think you can negotiate with them, of how do you convince them to relinquish nuclear weapons? And this has only happened, like in one case in the past of South Africa, under very different conditions and a very different relationship. And so this is always the struggle, and especially between US policy and South Korea policy, and what we're seeing happen today is what comes first. Can you have peace without denuclearization? Do you need denuclearization in order to have peace? And I think the way the North Koreans have always looked at this is that, until they don't feel threatened, they're going to continue to pursue ways to defend themselves against stronger militaries, because they have seen what's happened to, countries that the US didn't agree with their governments, that didn't have nuclear weapons. Iraq, Libya, countries that presumably, if they had nuclear weapons, that the US wouldn't have dared to do so. So I think there's a lot there where we've already said, no, you cannot do this, and there's consequences to your actions, but they've chosen to do it anyway. So, whether or not we can allow that, we've already done.
Thank you, Jenny. General Martin, and then Colonel Lee.
Jenny mentioned what comes first. I'm thinking of what I'm going to call a cultural conundrum, and some have spoken on this, that North Koreans want first a relationship, which then builds trust, which then allows a denuclearization to begin. The US and maybe many in the West want it exactly reversed. First they say denuclearize, That will reinforce trust, and then we'll build a political diplomatic relationship. So we're at odds there. We've got to reverse that. How do we do that? We, in very delicate, deliberate, intentional ways, but that cultural conundrum is playing out here, as many believe, because there are those who say North Korea wants to get to a place where they have security guarantees, especially with respect to China. What is China's role, and how can we help there? So I think that was an interesting concept to me.
Steve?
So let me just talk a little bit about what I think is a misunderstanding that North Korea is crazy or they don't, act rationally. And not being a North Korean apologist by any means. But if you look at it from their perspective, again, they're a country that's failed. They're nothing. Think about it. 25 million people. Okay, they have an economy that's failed. They have problems just feeding their people. But how do they keep countries of significance like South Korea and the United States pretty much at bay? And their strategy is number one, regime survival. And the way that they've latched onto that 25 years ago was ballistic missiles, intercontinental ballistic missiles, as well as nuclear weapons. Okay, so because that gets everyone's attention. And on top of that, they have what people consider to be odd or crazy behavior. So, hey, they're unpredictable. They said they're going to bomb the United States and they're going to do all this crazy stuff. Well, actually, from their perspective, it's actually pretty good strategic communications to continue to keep countries that are far more powerful and capable at bay. So, my point to our audience that's listening is, please never think of North Korea as crazy or as stupid. They are a formidable adversary, and we certainly need to make sure that we don't take our eyes off the ball there.
Thank you, Steve. Yeah, this is really, we could spend the whole webinar really discussing this one question. And just to assert moderator privileges, I said friends are always asking me this. My standard response to them is there's actually a very distinct and strategic method to the madness. And North Korea is really one of the most highly strategic and hyper-rational states in the world. And it's in large part because of the very constrained environment in which they operate, as our speakers have alluded to. And again, their fundamental desire to maintain control, and at the same time, again, not to engage in apologia. They can be both monstrous in terms of their human rights record, but still highly rational and strategic. Both things can be true at the same time, and indeed they are. And I might ask another question, which again, that's been posed, which we could speak for a whole webinar on, but that is, I'm sure going to combine two of them because of time. Should there be a shift in US policy that accepts North Korea's possession of nukes, much like India, Israel, and Pakistan, and can we trust a nuclear North Korea? Do I see any two-finger interventions from our speakers? No one wants to take this. Okay, Steve, here we go.
Okay, hey, so on the concept of, all options are on the table, I've always thought from the US government perspective, we should look at all possible options with North Korea. Okay, that means one side where you accept North Korea as a nuclear weapon state and publicly declare it. If you decide that you want to do that, what do we want out of that? Okay, otherwise we're going to just continue in this dilemma. I'm not advocating that we do that. I'm just saying we just take a very hard look at it to say, if we do give them this, because we know they value that, okay, what is it that we could get out of that? And if when you do the balancing to say, hey, we can get far more out of it than we give up, then let's go ahead and pursue that. But I don't think we've had a serious dialogue in the US government and even in the think tank world that talks about things like that. We have a pretty strong, robust policy that says we ain't doing that. Okay, now, as Jenny has mentioned, everybody knows they've got it. Okay, so that's how I'll address that.
Jenny?
I would add to that. I think we missed a big opportunity over the past couple of years. And I say that because, this idea of we should just, accept North Korea as a nuclear weapon state or a nuclear arms state. Over the past couple of years, North Korea, Kim Jong-un himself has talked about a commitment to denuclearization. Why would we give that up if North Korea is still willing to put it on the table? Certainly, it's not the same definition where it's not going to happen overnight. It's not going to happen quickly. You don't start the negotiation by North Korea coming and putting their nukes on the table and saying, what can we get for this? It's a process, and they see it as a process. And as General Martin talked about, the way they look at this is that the trust has to come first, the relationship has to come first in order to get to the end of the process. What you hear coming out of North Korea now, again, is wavering on this issue of whether denuclearization is still something they're willing to do or willing to negotiate. But this also cycles with the North Koreans. We have to wait and see if it comes back into the public narrative. And even in Kim Jong-un's statements over the past year, when negotiations haven't been good, even after Hanoi summit, when they talked about that denuclearization was not possible, it was still conditional until the US lifts its hostile policy. And so in that sense, the door is still open to put denuclearization back on the table. But I think we have to have a much more realistic understanding of what denuclearization means to them. And that none of this is going to be easy or quick, that it is a long-term process. And at the end of it is when you're going to get the result that the US technically wants at the beginning of it.
Thank you, Jenny. General Martin?
So incremental approach is clearly the requirement, and we maintain the three bins of diplomacy, sanctions, and military readiness for sure throughout this. But my question is, North Korea wants a bilateral with the United States. That's their goal. And they will marginalize and work the seams of any multilateral. But we have seen through history the most effective has been a multilateral engagement with North Korea. So can we bring back six-party talks? How do we bring in the Chinese, clearly the ROC, and reinforce that communication and trust there? Because I think that will be key to a peninsula piece. But it's that multilateral, I think, communication and trust that is also important.
Jenny, I think, wants to jump back in there.
Yeah, just a quick two-finger on that. I wouldn't say that the most progress has been made in a multilateral format, because the agreed framework was actually a good agreement and a lot was implemented on it, but it was cut before it was able to really reach its fruition. It was cut too soon and unilaterally cut in that process, which really undermines US credibility as a negotiating partner going forward. So I think, the North Koreans do actually prefer bilateral negotiations, whereas some part of, the larger regional discussion can be multilateral. But when it comes to nuclear issues, they do really prefer it to be a bilateral negotiation, but the US has to be willing to negotiate and can't just go back with the same offer over and over and over and expect them to change their mind.
Thank you, Jenny. Would that we could continue this conversation. It's easy to do, but there is a limit to everything, unfortunately. And I do want to alert our attendees, maybe friends of yours who wanted to join who couldn't, please let them know, and for you as well. We have recorded today's webinar, and we will at Stimson post it to our website, and the Alaska World Affairs Council will do so as well, so you can see this in perpetuity. As I alluded to at the start of our webinar, we had really been looking forward to the idea of coming to Alaska. And just before we started, Lisa actually showed us a picture of a black bear right outside of her home. So it's sort of vibrant wildlife, the reminder of how much we're missing out on not actually being able to come and visit, and we would love to. I also learned that there's more private per capita ownership of planes in Alaska than any other state, which I didn't know. So I learned something new. And in the spirit of our partnership, and again, with a hearty thanks to the World Affairs Council of Alaska, I want to pass things back to Lise, the CEO and president of the council. And before doing so, just very quickly, thank our speakers, General Martin, Colonel Lee, and of course, my colleague, Jenny Town, for their wonderful contributions. Lise?
Thank you, Clint. Thank you all the panelists for this interesting conversation. Jenny Town, Colonel Steve Lee, and General Rick Martin for joining us and making this discussion happen. This is a topic that's very important to us here. Like you mentioned, our proximity to the Korean Peninsula and the world is very strategic, and we feel it and we see it. And so conversations like this are very important to be had. So appreciate that. And thank you everyone for tuning in and listening and asking questions in the Q&A. We hope to see you all again soon. Like I said, come to our website at alaskaworldaffairs.org for more programs like this. And thank you to the Stimson Center. We hope to see you in Alaska in person and wish you well wherever you are in the world. Cheers. Have a great day.